Hi, everybody. I know what you're thinking. Where's all that cheesy music? Look, the only reason I played cheesy music is because, well, I've got this cheap microphone on my laptop and it makes that scratchy noise you're hearing. So I was just playing cheap, cheesy music to sort of cover up the scratching. But this week I'm not going to do that, and we'll just go with the scratchy microphone. Say, would you like to see my office? It's a little nicer office than most professors have. There. Every once in a while a tour group comes through and I have to stop working, and which is annoying, but other than that I really like it here. I mean, the technology in my office is, you just wouldn't even believe it. Huh. Looky here. There's a red phone here. I'd never noticed this before. Wonder what this red phone does if I pick up the handle. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. Oh, anyway. Look, I want to talk about last week and then give you a preview of coming attractions for this week, week 9. Let's start with last week's quiz. You guys did pretty good on the quiz. Everybody except one person took it. So I had 13 people in the class get both answers right. 3 people got one of them right and one wrong. And 5 people missed both of the main point quiz questions. So that's something we'll try to work on this week and hopefully see improvement through the rest of the quizzes to come. Remember, the quiz closes at Sunday at midnight, so you don't want to get jammed up reading the Zen and Lepore at the last minute, and that's the purpose of the study groups. I don't know what to think of the study groups, and I invite you to send me your feedback about that. It looks like people in this first time we tried the study groups struggled to coordinate, but this week you've got more time to get a head start on it, so I hope it will work better, especially your collaborative work at finding the main point. Last week's film guide, everything worked fine there technologically speaking. I don't think anybody had trouble posting. I wanted to show you some of the better answers so that you know how to get the full 200 points on your film guide. To get the full 200 points, you had to correctly identify what kind of film this was. It was a historical documentary. You needed to identify who made the film. And here some people are settling for the first thing that they see online and not digging deeper to get the actual writer or producer, the real brains behind the film. This film answer here comes from Erica Smith. She said this film was written and produced by Justin Sturkin and directed by Roger Goodman. That's correct. And then she tried to find out some information about these two writer-producers, and what she found was both have substantial resumes that heavily include documentary and history-related works. So that gives us confidence that we're watching a film that isn't made by some left or right-wing nut jobs, and that's a good thing to know. Why'd they make the film? Here, not a single person who turned in a film guide had a very good answer to this question. I'll come back to that in a minute. As for the main point, this is from Quinn Fabish, who I thought hit the main point right on the head. Due to a long line of conflicts that America was involved in, like the Great Depression and World War II and the Korean War and so forth, President Eisenhower believed that it was time to go back to an America that everybody knew and was comfortable with, the America that he grew up in. And that America of the 1920s was centered around conformity, stability, consumerism, and it was very conservative. However, change is inevitable. A new generation, mostly of young teens and adults, pushed these limits in the status quo by becoming a force to be reckoned with in pop culture, in social justice, and in politics. Way to go, Quinn. That is a very complete and accurate summation of the film's story, or its main message. Those of you who had some points taken off because your main point was inaccurate or not complete, take a look at Quinn's main point here and see how she fills in all of the essential elements of a good story. We've got characters, we've got an action, something that happens, We've got an obstacle to change, and we have attention to why this was significant. Okay, back to this question of sourcing. Why did Roger Goodman and Justin Sturken make this film? Just about everybody said it's because out of the goodness of their hearts, they wanted to enlighten people with information about the 1950s. Yeah, well, yeah, I guess so. But, I can guarantee you neither one of these guys, Sturken and Goodman, rolled out of bed one morning and just out of the goodness of their heart made a history documentary. The reason this film was made was to sell advertising space on the evening news at ABC. Because that's where this film first aired, in small little snippets in 1999 as the new millennium was coming in. And as part of their evening broadcast, ABC made a film series that replayed the 20th century. And the constraints they were under when making this film was they couldn't make anything that would alienate advertisers from not wanting to sponsor the evening news. So that's why the film was made, was to help ABC sell airtime to advertisers on the evening news. And if you know that, now you know something about the idea value of the film. There's not going to be anything terribly controversial in it, nothing that would scare advertisers away or make somebody change the channel from ABC in a rage and go watch CBS or NBC. It's going to be a kind of middle of the road point of view on everything. So this week I challenge you to double down on the sourcing heuristic when you're filling out your film guides and see if you can give a real answer to the question, why did they make this film? This week, we turn our attention to the Black freedom struggle in the second half of the 20th century. And your film is a wonderful film called Freedom Riders. Now, I warn you, it's longer than the films we've been watching. Freedom Riders is 2 hours long, but it is riveting. You'll find the film guide online at Moodle, and that's where I want you to post your film guide when you're done watching the film. Now, spoiler alert for Freedom Riders, you've never seen a film about the civil rights movement like this film before. And that's a good thing. You know how I've told you that the world is made of stories, right? Well, it's an interesting thing about the civil rights movement that it's probably now one of the better known stories of American history to people your age. One historian has studied how American history textbooks in high school tell the history of the civil rights movement, and he has argued that there's a common story that appears in every textbook about the civil rights movement, even down to the same pictures being featured in the pages. Here we see a page from The Americans, which is the best-selling United States history textbook for high school students. Many of you probably learned what you know about the civil rights movement from this very book. All the books agree, though, and so we can speak of a conventional narrative or a dominant narrative about the civil rights movement that most Americans your age and maybe a little older know, having gone through high school history classes and your secondary education. And on this page, we can begin to see what the story is. It starts in 1954 there on the timeline and runs into the early 1970s. It's a story about really one or two people, Martin Luther King and maybe Rosa Parks too. It's a story that's set in the South. That's where the action takes place. And its main characters are saintly heroes like King and Parks who led the action. And what they wanted is indicated by the name of this story, the story of the civil rights movement. They wanted civil rights for African Americans and all Americans too. They were aided in this by a friendly federal government. In fact, the story begins with the United States Supreme Court outlawing segregation in the nation's public schools. So the federal government, along with these saintly heroes, leads the way to make change happen. And of course, there's enemies, the obstacles to overcome in this dominant narrative about the civil rights movement. The enemies are prejudiced persons, white, Southern racists for the most part, who stand in the way. To overcome the enemy, our saintly heroes use a number of tools or instruments, but especially demonstrations and protest marches and sit-ins, things like that. And it works. Maybe the biggest and best tool the heroes had was the tool of eloquence, especially the eloquence of Martin Luther King in particular. And so the most iconic moment in this story is when King goes to Washington, D.C. in 1963 and says, "I have a dream of an America someday where little black children and white children hold hands and play together." The plot of this story in our American history high school textbooks is a linear march ever upward and onward towards a colorblind society, which is mostly obtained by the 1970s. The plot can be even more specific than that. It sometimes is plotted as David versus Goliath, where David are the young civil rights activists marching against the Goliath of a Southern racist police system that is defending segregation. But because white people and black people came together and marched together, we all overcame the darker forces of American history, and that's the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement, as you learned it in school. Folks, as a historian, I'm here to tell you that almost every aspect of this story gets it wrong. And so that's our project for this week 9 in our course. So we want to use the sources of information we have to try to challenge this dominant narrative and write a truer and better story. If the world is made of stories, one of the corollaries to that is stories can be very dangerous things. They can be very dangerous things when the stories are inaccurate, or misleading, or false. I mean, we just recently seen a great illustration of this in the COVID-19 crisis. You saw images of all those college students partying the night away at spring break on beaches in Florida and Mexico. What was the story in their head about coronavirus? It was the story that they had in their head was, it's in China, it's not here. I'm young, I can overcome this. It's an old person's disease. It can't hurt me. So I'm going to drink Corona beer all night and all day and not worry about the coronavirus. Stories tell us who we are and what we're going to do next. And now those kids partying the spring break with that bad story in their head are paying the price, because we now know that many of the hot spots across the country were caused by spring breakers coming back from the beaches and bringing the coronavirus to their hometowns. Stories can be dangerous things when they're misleading or false. And so it is with the dominant narrative of the civil rights movement. Let me show you an illustration that also reminds us again of the power of the sourcing heuristic. This is one of the most requested photographs from the National Records Administration. And I think we can say that this photograph of the March on Washington in 1963 seems to support the dominant narrative that our high school history textbooks tell. Why do I say it supports the dominant narrative? Well, look at the center line here in the road, and who do we find standing right on it or very near it? Martin Luther King. This photograph is telling a story about the civil rights movement where King is leading the way, and he's got his arms locked with other saintly heroes of the movement. I see A. Philip Randolph there on the far right, who originally proposed the March on Washington way back during World War II days. And look how orderly everything is. We've got leaders and followers, neatly printed signs. This is how protest happens in the United States. That's what the photograph says to people. Now, who took this photograph? That would be the sourcing move we need to make here. The photographer who took this photograph worked for the United States Information Agency. That was the propaganda arm of the United States during the Cold War. From 1954 to about 1999, the United States Information Agency was responsible for telling stories about the United States to the world so that the world would think well of America and want to be in the American camp, not on the Soviet side of things. So, this photographer got his picture to tell a story about orderly, peaceful protest in the United States. That's how American democracy works, is the message to the world. Can we trust this photograph? By itself, I don't think so, not especially now that we know who took it and what it was going to be used for. It would be nice to corroborate the evidence of this photograph with another photograph, wouldn't it? And as it happens, we can do that. I'm going to show you another photograph taken just a few feet away from this one and from a different angle, and watch how the story changes. See the line of heroes there? But now they're swallowed up by a large and unruly crowd that's all around them. What's really going on here? In the propaganda photograph, the photographer's trying to make it out like Martin Luther King and these other male heroes are the leaders of the civil rights movement. In fact, on the morning of the march in Washington, our heroes were up on Capitol Hill in meetings with congressmen. The march was scheduled to begin at 10 in the morning. At 9 in the morning, Martin Luther King and the others got frantic phone call from some of their aides saying, "Martin, John, Philip, you got to get down here. They're starting the march without you." And in John Lewis's memoir of his life, he remembers Bayard Rustin looking out a window from Capitol Hill and saying, "My God, they're already going. We're supposed to be leading them, and they're leading us." And so the leaders hopped into taxis and were driven down to Pennsylvania Avenue, where they stepped into the crowd, had this photograph taken to make it look like they were leading the way, and then followed the people who are actually doing the leading. Yeah, so you see, this photograph would be an example of evidence one might use to challenge the dominant narrative about who led the civil rights movement. What this photograph suggests, and it's just one photograph, of course, so we'd want other evidence too, but what the photograph clearly suggests is that the civil rights movement was being led by thousands of unnamed and unremembered people who were literally out in front of the official leadership. So that's my challenge to you this week as you watch Freedom Riders and as you read Howard Zinn and Jill Lepore. How do these sources of information contest the story of the civil rights movement as you know it? How do they complicate the dominant narrative? How do they expand what we should know about the civil rights movement? How do they bring to life the cut and dried narrative of the high school history textbook that you had in school? Can you do that this week? Take your sources of information and try to write a new story of the civil rights movement. It may even require you to change the name of what you call this thing. Now, to help you do this, I'm going to post on Moodle 2 scorecards, one for Howard Zinn and one for Jill Lepore. The scorecards will help you see how Zinn and Lepore are complicating or changing the story, or not. It could be that they just tell the old story, in which case that would be a bad thing, I think. because historians no longer believe that old story to be sufficiently true to be a good story. The scorecard has spaces for when the movement happened, where, what the central act was about, who were the actors, what were the instruments they used to do what they wanted to do, and so on and so forth. And as you read in Zen and Lepore, you might fill in the box with what they say about when it happened and where they are up to date with recent historical scholarship. You can put a check in the far right column, and that way, at a glance, you can see whether Zen and Lepore are keeping up with the latest scholarship. Well, that's all for now. And I hope this week works well for the study groups. For those of you who are flying on your own, good luck to you. If you want to take quizzes early, just let me know. I miss you guys. So one thing that would be kind of fun is maybe if you would send me a photograph this week. Post your photograph to the Brew by the Slough forum on Moodle. Take a photograph of yourself reading Zen or Lepore, and the weirder the place, the better. Okay, bye now. See you next week.